As I mentioned, we have been working through the parables, and here we are to be discussing this intriguing little text. So rich and so weighty in such a few words. It's not the place that we go to gather our doctrine of future things, but it certainly is a place that gives us some enlightenment on some very significant principles and issues in regarding future things. This is a story of contrasts. If there's anything that Jesus wants to see the listeners to understand from this little tale, is simply the complete, absolute, upside down, inside out, one side flipped to the other side, back and forth contrasts that take place in this story. Just take a few minutes, and this is just really scratching the surface, but as I've read this to you, if you think about this, this is what the story is really about. Contrasts and reversals. We have a poor man, we have a rich man. We have the poor man who becomes rich, and the rich man who becomes poor. We have the poor man outside the gate who has no home. We have a rich man inside his gate, inside his luxurious home. We have a poor man with no food, longing for food that falls from the rich man's table, a rich man who is eating sumptuously every day. We have a poor man who suffers. We have a rich man who is satisfied. And so the contrast goes. And then here comes the reversals. Now the rich man suffers and the poor man is satisfied. But then the poor man is at a feast. The rich man can't even find a drop of water to cool his tongue. The poor man who is comforted by dogs becomes comforted by God himself. The rich man who lived in daily comfort now finds himself in agony. The poor man is humiliated and he becomes honored. The rich man lives honored and becomes humiliated. And so it goes on and back and forth. And this is, if you spend time, there's almost seems like there's no end. It seems an infinite number of contrasts and reversals. That's what this story is. Jesus sets this up to flip the whole thing on its head, to make the point that you just don't know. Not that you can't know, but there isn't a sense of security, naturally speaking, within the heart of a person on what their future holds, naturally speaking. This is not a story about the negativity of being rich. This is not they say that being rich is wrong and being poor is right, and that the rich will go to hell, if you will, and the poor will end up in heaven. That's not what the story is. Let's look at it. Bit of context. I'll just read this to you without comment, but these are the few verses before this text, and you'll begin to see that Jesus had just told a story, a parable about wealth. He says this: one who is faithful in very little is also faithful in much, and one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. If then you have not been faithful with the righteous wealth, who will entrust you to true riches? And if you have not been faithful with that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. And now with those comments, here's what happens. The Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all these things and they ridiculed him. Now, that's pretty much what we would expect and what we see throughout the conflict between the so-called upper echelons of the Jewish faith and Jesus. It's constant conflict, and they are now doing this again. And what I find interesting is something that we even see today. I don't know if you've had this situation, but to me this is a classic response that we even get even in our conversations with our friends. You'll notice that it says, the text, they ridiculed him. The attack was not on the things he said. They didn't discern in themselves, was what he said accurate and true? Was this honest? Was this something that you could find a biblical text for and prove to be right or wrong? They didn't worry about what he said. They just attacked him. And I don't know if you've had this situation, but this is just a classic response. You can make a truth statement today, and you can say something that is verifiably true, that can now be taken and examined whether or not it's true or not. But the person hearing you doesn't want to hear and discern and take the time to discern whether or not this is a truth statement. Instead, the attack is immediately turned, and the response is, well, you're a bigot. Well, whether I'm a bigot or not has nothing whatsoever to do with whether what I just said is true or not. You have just changed the subject and turned the tables so that you can now disregard everything that I have just said, or think you can, just because you think you've pushed me now into some sort of a negative position in social circles, in the eyes of society. So you think now that that's true of me, and therefore, whether or not what I've said is true doesn't have to be examined. This is the smoke that people blow up all the time when conversations begin around the things of Christ. We get accused of something that has nothing to do with the truth claims that we make. Same thing for Jesus. Doesn't matter what he said. They begin to ridicule him. What does this poor man know about riches? Look at his background. Look at his lineage. He comes from a mother, we don't even know who his father is. He's got the whole thing is shady. He's just a carpenter, blah, 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 blah. They have every reason to put him down, completely disregarding, is what he said actually true or not? Disregard that because you can tear down his character. It's a smokescreen. Classic response. And so it goes. When the human heart is so full of pride that it doesn't want to listen to truth, is not interested in truth, any excuse will do not to listen. The parable that Jesus is about to tell is for them because of this situation and this conflict. He said to them, "You are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your heart." They believe that their wealth, their superior race, if you will, situation and place in society gave them an automatic in with God. That they were superior just by virtue of what they had and what they knew and their position in life, and they never gave any thought to the real questions. The real questions they were blinded to because they automatically assumed them because of their own self-importance. Pride kills. For what is exalted among men is an abomination in the sight of God. The parable that he now tells of the rich man and Lazarus is what happens when affluence grabs a hold of your heart and blinds you to who you really are. You become convinced that your independence from God is obvious. That's what happens to us in a society that we live in the affluence that we know. Some of you may not feel very rich. Okay, fine. It's a relative term. You may not be rich, maybe to the person sitting next to you. I don't know. You might feel yourself to be very, very well off and very wealthy. It's irrelevant in the great scheme of things because the whole thing is entirely relative. Poor is poor. Is it the person who has no bread at all, or the person who has one stale crust of bread? Who's more poor? Who's really poor? How do you rate this? But what happens is, the human heart, which is already bent towards being in rebellion against God, the human condition, which is already struggling in its independence from God, when affluence comes into a person's life, it convinces them, somehow it deludes them into believing that my independence from God must be true. Look, I really don't need him. I don't actually need to pray, give us this day our daily bread. I've got enough money to buy all the bread I want. And suddenly something in my heart begins to actually cause me to believe I actually don't need God. And affluence can affect everybody's hearts and minds and cause them to begin to feel a little more self-important, a little more comfortable, a little more free to take a step back because we really aren't really actually dependent on God. In truth, if you allow your mind to go where it wants to, as in this case, you begin to believe yourself to be so superior to other people that you can walk into a room and it's so obvious to you that you're superior. Because this guy in his hillbilly clothes and his 3.5 teeth can't even put a sentence together, and you, with your education and superior position in society, are obviously far greater important person than that person is. It's so obvious to you. And suddenly, your obvious position, but everybody else in society, you assume that God feels the same way. I'm awesome. When I die, God will have no obligation except to accept me when I rap on his door because I am basically as awesome as I think I am. It's the blindness of affluence that has grabbed the whole hearts of the listeners, and Jesus is about to confront them. He's about to tell them a story to cause them to flip the whole thing on its head. You think in your heart that somehow, because of who you think about yourself, that you've got some position, that you've got some notoriety, that you've got some in. And he tells them a story. There was a rich man clothed in purple. Again, I've said already, and I'll just reiterate the fact that this is a rich man who becomes the poor man, and the poor man becomes the rich man. This is not about wealth. This is not condemning wealth. You understand this? Just borrowing the principle that wealth brings to people's hearts. The affluence, how it manipulates your mind. And he describes this rich man, he's clothed in purple, which to us might seem a little audacious and odd. But in the first century, this is automatically a symbol of great wealth. To dye clothes purple, not to go into the great details of it, but it comes from a shellfish that you have to do a process to, and you grab out of the shellfish 1 drop of dye. You would save that drop of dye, get more shellfish until you have a vat of purple dye. It's the only way to make purple in the first century. If you had anything purple, you were extraordinarily wealthy because it was extraordinarily difficult to make purple dye. They had all kinds of roots and vegetables and all kinds of things that they used to dye other things, other colors. But purple was a challenging color. And this man, you'll notice, it says he was clothed, as Jesus tells the story. It's just a parable, but he slathers on the wealth. Every day of his life, everything he owns is purple. Maybe not your fancy color, but it's just to show the decadence of the man and his wealth. That's the point. He's clothed in purple, and he adds fine linen. Now, this is a little tongue-in-cheek. This phrase for fine linen is actually referring to his unmentionables. And it's actually, Jesus is kind of just throwing in a little funny thing here, that this guy's dressed in purple, and even his underwear is posh. This guy is dressed to the nines all the time. That's kind of what he's implying here. This guy is the top of everything. And on top of this, his lifestyle is Thanksgiving dinner every day. He feasted sumptuously. What a great word. Isn't that a great word? Sumptuously. What conjures up in your mind when you hear the word sumptuously? Everything in my mind is golden brown and covered in gravy and just hot and steaming, and I'm getting hungry talking about the word. Every day. That's the picture. And now the contrast. And at his gate was laid a poor man. Now in the first century, if you were a person of wealth and means, it was somewhat socially incumbent upon you to care for those who were needy. And it wasn't unusual that if you were a person of means, that someone would possibly come to your door and you were somewhat socially obligated to help that person because you were a person in the village of some wealth. And so they didn't have a social net that we have and all the ins and outs of government and all the like. And it's just the way Jews cared for each other. It was the way they lived. And in fact, if you were very ill, you might be brought to someone's house and they might have mercy on you, and the wealthy person may bring you into their home and give you, at least in your last dying days, if not hours, at least some measure of comfort, to lay your head on a soft pillow and to die at least in some measure of physical comfort. And so this is the scene that Jesus, it's foreign to us, but that's what he, in a few sentences, puts this together, and every Jew listening knows what he's saying. There's a rich man living decadently. There's a poor man laid at his gate. In fact, the word laid here is actually the word for throw, balo. And it is a really interesting picture. Somebody, the backstory is your imagination because it's just a parable, but somebody came and, opened the taxi door and just dumped this guy out and keeps on driving. They bring this, he plops him down, the poor man, at his gate. So now we know that the rich man actually has a compound. He has a gate. So this is how wealthy he is. And he is just wanting some mercy. That's the picture. If this rich man socially now obligated to the man who's come looking for help. And this is an interesting thing. This is the only time in all of the 40 or so parables that Jesus tells, and parables, I'll just remind you, are made up stories. The only time that he actually uses a proper name. This has caused some people a measure of interest, if not consternation. The poor man was named Lazarus. Now, the name Lazarus means the one God helps. And I think there's a reason that Jesus actually just uses a name. There's a couple reasons. One will may become clear to the end if you remember back to an event from another Lazarus. But a poor man named Lazarus. Now, some people take this to mean in some way that somehow this must be a true story. That what Jesus is actually leaning on is an event that took place because, look, he's naming somebody. I don't believe that's the case, and I don't think that's the proper use of any time that we come to a parable to try and insert some sort of reality into it. It's a story. I'm just going on about that because sometimes you will hear people mention this, but it remains a parable. So the rich man who is covered in purple, what is the poor man covered in? Stores. The contrast. And he desired, instead of eating sumptuously, he desired to be fed from what fell from the rich man's table. So this is sort of a interesting first century thing, but if you were wealthy, at the end of the meal, you would clean your hands using bread, perhaps even stale bread. They ate with their hands. They would, often at a sumptuous meal like this, you would sit close to the floor. You would lean on your left arm, very foreign to our 21st century, knife and fork, tablecloth, napkin kind of scene, but that's the way they did it. Down on the floor, you'd have your feet out to the side, and you would eat with one hand, and you would tear bread, and you would pick up whatever meat puree or whatever was going on, and you would eat this. So your fingers would take on whatever you've been eating with, and so you would grab a piece of bread, and you would run the bread through your fingers. Or you might, if it's depending on the kind of bread, stick your finger into the bread and you would just clean your hands. Then you would take this piece of bread and you would throw it under the table for the dogs. Now, if anybody isn't fighting their gag reflex right now, this guy's thinking about wanting to eat that bread. That's how hungry he is. You got to be kind of hungry in my mind to go there. Just saying. Personal thing, and clearly we live in a place where we're always well fed. He desired to be fed what fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, the only comfort he had is the scene here. The only comfort the man gets are the dogs. And they come and lick his sores. And if you weren't fighting your gag reflex before, maybe you are now. These are not little puppies, by the way, cute little things that we have domesticated. These are dogs. The closest thing we might think of is a coyote. It's not a coyote, but for the sake of speaking to Canadians, I don't know what we have that comes close to this kind of a creature. It's a wild animal that they would probably have been using as guard dogs. These guard dogs come and stick their head through the gate, and the only comfort this man gets from the wealthy man is that his sores at least are relieved by the wet tongue of a dog. That's the scene, the contrast, the rich and the poor. And then everything flips on its head. The poor man died and was carried to Abraham's side. Now, we don't want to make too much of the fact that it mentions Abraham's side. This is just a euphemistic expression for what we would explain to be heaven, for the lack of a better way to say that. Abraham is pictured here because Jesus is speaking to the Jews who believe that their very lineage gives them some in with God. That the fact that their bloodline can be traced back to Abraham is proof positive that God has to deal favorably with them. They're wealthy, they're important. This sick man at the door, as Jesus would be telling the story, they would be believing, well, of course, he's a good for nothing. He's sick because he's a sinner. That was the thinking of the day. They would have been looking at this and assuming the exact opposite of what's about to take place. And the poor man died and was carried to Abraham's side. And the picture here is exactly what I've just described to you of the man eating sumptuously. He is now at Abraham's right hand. He is now in the honored position at a feast. He is the one sitting on his elbow with his head almost like as it were leaning on Abraham's chest. He is now brought to the honored position in a feast. That's the picture. The Jews would have been listening to this like, wow, this guy's out of his mind. This is truly a made-up story. This is not how things go down. The poor man dies, and he ends up sitting beside Abraham eating sumptuously. The rich man also died and was buried. Do you notice the difference between the two right there? The poor man, he got no funeral. He just died. Nameless man picked up, probably thrown into the heap, the garbage heap, and the rich man, he gets a funeral. He gets all the people coming, making sandwiches and eating potato salad and talking about how great he was and the whole thing. And that's dignity to the Jew. He got what is dignified way to respond to a death. He got a burial. Not the poor man. And in Hades, that's a New Testament phrase for what we would term hell, for lack of a better quick explanation. In Hades, being in torment, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham far off and Lazarus at his side. Now, this is where we begin to recognize afresh, again, this is a parable. This is not a description of reality. We know from other places in the Bible and the way that things are described that this is not how it works. You're not sitting there with a pair of binoculars and you can recognize. And how he knew this was Abraham and Lazarus, obviously they were wearing name tags. And he sees them far off. That was sarcasm, by the way, in case you're concerned. It's not bad theology. He sees them far off according to this. And he recognizes that Lazarus is with Abraham. And so he calls out, Father Abraham. Notice he uses the proper term, Father Abraham. He's acknowledging, he's playing, to put it bluntly, he's playing the Jew card. Hey, I'm the one who's got the Jewish lineage. You are my father spiritually, so he thinks. You are the one who I'm connected to. Don't you know me? It's me. Remember? Hey, Father Abraham, we're connected, so guess what? You owe me. Here come the requests. Have mercy on me and send Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I'm in anguish in this flame. Now this I find one of the most fascinating, most intriguing parts in all of the New Testament. I don't know if this will grab your head the way it flips mine around, but this is unlike anything we would expect to see when someone wakes up and finds themselves in the torment of God's judgment. In my little imagination, I see somebody passing from this life to the next and suddenly realizing they've made a terrible error. Suddenly coming to their senses, somehow coming to some recognition of failure somewhere in their life, somehow coming to a place of, what have I done? What have I not done? Oh, it's true. Oh, it wasn't true. Some epiphany. And now suddenly turning, and you might expect, oh, Lazarus, I'm so sorry. I had no idea that you were, I didn't recognize my own arrogance. I was so rude to you. I was so cruel. Forgive me. Oh, I'm sorry. None of it. This is fascinating to me. This man wakes up in hell, and he is the same ignorant, arrogant person that he was on earth. His position in his mind has gone nowhere. Get that guy there. Get him to come to me. I need someone to serve me. He looks like someone who's beneath us all. Send him. Get him to come and do to me what I need. I need some help. Hey, waiter. That's what he's doing. Can you believe this? This is what happens to a soul who wakes up on the other side of this life and realizes they've made a vast error. They have not changed one iota. Why do people go there? Because they want to go there. And what happens when they end up there? They are exactly who they were. Do you know why hell is eternal? Because you sin eternally. Because you never stop being in the stubborn, arrogant position that you were in when you rejected Christ to begin with. And that's this man. He remains exactly who he is. And notice what he says. Not asking for a garden hose. He's not asking for a bucket of water. He is in such anguish that if he could just feel one drop, picture this, one drop hanging on the end of his finger. If you could just cool my tongue, it would feel like Niagara Falls. That's how little I need to feel refreshment because of the kind of torment I'm in. This is a contrast between the blessing of God and the judgment of God. And the fact that he wakes up, and get this, it doesn't end there. Abraham said, child, so he recognizes the bloodline. He acknowledges there's a bloodline. Child, remember that in your lifetime you received your good things, and Lazarus in his lifetime, in like manner, bad things. But now, surprisingly enough, I know it's shocking to you. I know you didn't see this coming. But now he's comforted here and you're in anguish. It's again, not because one was rich and one was poor. We don't know the backstory. Lazarus' heart obviously was right with God. The rich man was not. It's got nothing to do with rich and poor. He's just making a statement that your present situation is no indication of your future situation. That you can't presume upon God that you've got this all sorted out. There needs to come some point where your head gets in gear and you begin to analyze your own situation and you begin to take these things seriously and you begin to weigh the claims of Christ and you actually think for yourself and make a decision for yourself without your assumptions, without your just jumping on the bandwagon because you think that's good enough, because you think somehow God owes you something, without ever engaging your head, without completely disregarding this and that and another thing. He's saying, just stating the fact. Besides all this, he says, between us and you, a great chasm has been fixed. Now, this again isn't giving us the geography of things. It's just a parable. But we do know that this is clear throughout the rest of Scripture, that there is no second chances, that there is no going back and forth. There is no universalism, which is still taught today. That everybody goes to heaven one day. That if you do something wrong and you actually end up under God's judgment, that it's only a matter of time until you work off that judgment and God in its mercy eventually will empty hell and everybody goes to heaven. That's not what the Bible teaches even remotely. It is black and white, clear, line drawn. It's plain. There is a chasm fixed, is what he says. And you can't go from one to the other. There's no back and forth here. So even if you wanted him to come, he can't. It's almost as if somehow Abraham in the story knows that if you ask Lazarus, he will do this for you. But he can't. Death is final. And he said, then I have another request. If you're not going to send him now to be my servant, then will you at least send him to be my messenger boy? I beg you, Father, to send him to my father's house. Now, do you see what is implied in this? There's a complaint underlining here. See, I didn't know about this. I had no warning that this was going to come. So I'm kind of in an unfair situation. So now you need to make things fair, okay? You need to go and at least warn my brothers because they don't know either. You haven't been fair about this because you didn't tell us. So now, you better make things right. Send that little messenger boy off and tell my family because they have no idea what's waiting for them. So you better go and straighten this out. Do you see what's going on? You know, this is the thinking of the world, that hell is just unfair. And that nobody actually deserved this, and nobody should go there. And it's wrong. And God is mean and vindictive and cruel and vicious. And the whole thing, it's God's fault. Abraham said, They have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them. That's the Old Testament. Moses, the law, the prophets are the prophets. That's the Old Testament. He has what we would say, they have the Bible. Let them listen to the Bible. I've spoken and I've told them everything they need to know, and it's their free will. It's not my position to force them to listen. I have told them what they need to know. It's up to them to decide to engage their minds in this situation. They, as Jews in their culture, have gone to the synagogue every Saturday. They have sat under the word. If they didn't hear it then, they're not going to hear it. Their hearts are not listening. Their ears are not engaged. And he said, no. Do you love the argument? No, Abraham, let me straighten you out. You don't understand. No, thank you. The Bible is not enough. No, Abraham. Let me help you with your theology. See, I'm now in the enlightened position of being in torment here in this place. I can help straighten you out on what you need to do to make sure people don't come here. Let me help you with this. This is how arrogant this man is. No, Father Abraham, if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent. He said to him, if they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone should rise from the dead. I think this is one of the reasons that Jesus uses the word and the name Lazarus. Do you remember there's a man in the New Testament named Lazarus? Yes, you do. John chapter 11. To Lazarus. Jesus stands at his tomb. He speaks a few words. Lazarus, come forth. You remember what happens? So this man Lazarus is still alive. And Jesus is speaking to them. And now he says, even if someone should raise from the dead, hint, hint, you're still not going to believe. You remember that? And they know exactly what he's talking about. And they recognize, and we recognize this. Even in the historic truth of the resurrection of a man in the first century, people don't believe. If they're not going to believe, they're not going to believe. Now, what do we do with this parable? Interesting story that it is. We're not the Jews that Jesus was speaking to. Let's try to put a bow on this and bring some measure of some thoughts and clarity. Things that make us feel self-important can cause us to be self-deluded to our need of grace. Lesson 1. You can get so full of yourself from your own position, from your own privileged background, from the fact that you're Canadian and you're not an American. That is the funniest thing to me. We are so proud of the fact that we're not proud. Has anybody ever noticed that? We go around talking about our privileged race, that we're not them. Clearly we're superior because we're not them, because they think they're superior and we know we don't think we're superior. What? So that makes us superior. It doesn't make any sense. But that's how quickly it seeps into our thinking, that we just somehow get this deluded thinking of ourselves, of our own self-importance. I don't know all together who's here this morning. I know a good number of you. But I don't know your hearts, everybody. I don't know if you're actually just self-deluded enough to think that somehow God owes you some in because you've got some brownie points somewhere along the way, because you think you've earned something, your position, your whatever. Whether it's your background or your culture, your status in life, whatever, the list is endless. It has deluded you into thinking somehow that you actually don't need to engage your mind the things of Christ. And you rest on your own self-importance. It can cause you to be deluded to your need of grace. Second little point, just to point out and try to make this practical to us. Living without consideration for the life to come. I don't know how to say this any more plainly. It's an utter act of foolishness. And this is the way people live, and we've talked about this on Sunday night, so this is just the common thinking. I personally I can't get my head around this. How is it that people could be so lackadaisical about something so important? It baffles me. It makes me want to just stand up and scream. Do you not want to consider, you're just going to fling your soul into eternity and take a shot at it and see what happens? You never even thought to consider and actually analyze and decide, does God actually exist? Has he really spoken to us in a person named Jesus? Is Jesus really the Son of God as he raised from the dead? Should I actually commit my life? I don't have time for such thoughts. I'm too busy doing my thing. You know, Jesus told a parable about this. Someone in the crowd said, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over you?" He said to them, "Take care, be on your guard against the covetousness of one's life, because the stuff that you want blinds your thinking and dements your focus. For one's life does not consist in the abundance of your possessions. No, there's more to life. You have an eternal soul to consider. And when your heart gets covetous and you start grasping after stuff, somehow the stuff becomes your idol, and somehow you completely lose any sense of a need to think about things." If I talk about living in a culture that doesn't ever stop to think, I think we are the stupidest culture, if I can say that politely, about ourselves, that I've read of in history. We are the most unthinking culture. Maybe I'm wrong. Next time you watch a little new kitten on a YouTube video, you ask yourself, am I thinking or am I just being stupid? What is with us? We entertain ourselves till we're ready to throw up, and we never stop and ask big questions. He told them a parable, saying, "The land of a rich man produced plentiful." He thought to himself, "What shall I do, for I have nowhere to store my crops?" Oh, that's the most important thing. He said, "I'll do this. I'll tear down my barns, build larger barns. There I'll store my grain and my goods. I'll say to my soul, 'Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Retire. Relax, eat, drink, be merry.'" Oh, never gave a thought to the fact that life is more than the stuff you see. And God said to him, "Fool! This night your soul is required of you. The things you've prepared, whose will they be? What good is that for you? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich towards God." We live in a culture that doesn't bother to stop and think and ask big questions. I was parking at the hospital not that long ago. I have a little badge that lets me park. They're very gracious to us, the clergy in town, so we don't have to pay for parking every time we go to the hospital. Could be several times a week or a day even. So they give us a little badge so we can get in, boop, and the arm goes up and we can park in the staff parking lot in the back. I discovered, that I can also, boop, through the staff door that's also at the back, which is really great in winter. Now you don't have to walk around the building to the front. So I happen to be in the staff parking lot, getting out of my car. Awkwardly enough, a stranger woman's getting out of her car beside each other, and we're almost walking now shoulder to shoulder, neither one of us wanting to talk to each other. Walking towards the hospital door. She clearly works there and knows where she's going, and she doesn't want to go through that door, which is a secured door that you beep. Without checking out who I am, I give her that. Good for her. So she says, she's trying to glance down at my badge like she's not really looking at it. I don't think I know you. I said, "Well, I'm just one of the clergy in town. I pastor at a church here, and they've given me a badge," and I just, "Right, yes, okay, good." So we're still walking, and now we're getting closer to the door. And what church are you at? So, of course, I tell her, "Oh, and where's that?" Okay, maybe she's not living in Bracebridge, fair enough. So I give her the location. That instantly is the end of our conversation. I don't know what I said. I don't know what we've done, but she almost ran. As soon as the door, we got through that, we're beside each other, chatting, "Hey, nice day." We get through the door, and immediately her gait picks up, and she starts like scurrying. And I'm thinking, okay, maybe she's late for work. I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. But I can't help but be paranoid that all she's thinking is I'm about to pull her head off and shove a Bible down her neck. It's just me. The culture we live in, it makes you paranoid. Maybe I can give her the benefit of the doubt, had nothing to do with it. But that was the body language that I saw. Do you know what I see? Someone who has never taken the time to think, to examine. Maybe there's a possibility to this. No, brush the whole thing off. It's religion. We don't need that. What kind of an unthinking person is this? Just saying. Third thing I want to say, just try to bring some clarity and practicality to this, is we need to live our lives in light of eternal consequences. This life is not what life is about. You know that, I know that. But sometimes we get blinded. Sometimes as believers we get distracted. Sometimes we forget. We get so consumed with such foolish things. There is an eternity that is beyond all of this, for which we will be held account for how we live now and what we do now with what we have now. We know that from what we've seen of Scripture and what we've been learning from Jesus' teaching. Our lives need to be lived now in light of what is to come. It changes everything. That changes what you do with your finances and your time and your retirement and your life, and on and on and on it goes. Because this is not all there is. And it changes our entire perspective. And this is the story Jesus told.